Over a century ago in 1896, the bubonic plague broke out in colonial Bombay. Much like the recent pandemic, conversations during the plague also centered around questions of isolation, hospitalization, disinfection, inoculation, and even misinformation. While the British officials maintained detailed records of the various aspects of the plague, local newspapers reported on the public sentiment towards the disease and its colonial management. Our guest for today, Ranjit Kandalgaonkar, explored one such archive to draw out a subaltern narrative of the bubonic plague. With the support of the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, we speak to Ranjit about his artistic representation of the historical event and the importance of doing such research a century later. I am Vaishnavi Shukla, and this is Architecture of Center, a podcast where we highlight contemporary discourses that shape the built environment but do not occupy the center stage in our daily lives. We speak to radical designers, thinkers, and changemakers who are deeply engaged in redefining the way we live and interact with the world around us.
Interestingly enough, I started watching this Netflix series called Explained. It's an old series. It has a different episode. It's had 4 series now, and in the second season, just yesterday, there's an episode on the next pandemic, and there are all sorts of people. So this was released back in 2019, 2018, or something. And you have people like the Bill Gates, they're interviewing him, and it's like, when do you think the next pandemic is going to be? And they're like, it should be like already being born and being transmitted somewhere in the world. It's just a matter of time before it becomes a global pandemic. And lo and behold, it actually happened. So Netflix had to go back and put a disclaimer in the episode description that this was recorded like pre-COVID. So and then COVID happened after that. So your work kind of falls within that kind of a time and space chronological frame, where what we're going to talk about today actually happened before COVID. So it's not like you've gone ahead and done all of this because we went through a pandemic. It's in fact the otherwise.
Yeah.
And you were talking about drawing the Bombay plague, which is a project that you worked on, and it's a combination of archival work, something that you eventually produced as a drawing. And I think there's a lot of things to unpack. So my first question is fairly simple. What led you to explore a medical emergency that actually took place over 100 years ago?
So I'm a visual artist, and I'm not only visual, but I do all sorts of kind of multimedia works, etc. Over the years, started off as a painter, and kind of, in the broad sense, I'm all over the place. But it's just the way it's happening. But I was working on a different project. I was working on a project that looked at 19th century trusts, and it was a drawing project, and it was documenting community-run institutions. And one aspect of that was the plague, which is like a watershed moment in the city's timeline. So it's a point in the timeline where, like, the Bombay Improvement Trust comes in to improve, conditions. The authorities start paying more attention. That it's not only about one type of activity that's happening, but also that you have to look back in and take care of the city more. All of those things. But while I was busy looking at the trusts, I was also very much interested in the public health trusts, which were kind of stepping in and doing a certain kind of work, in the plague and the post-plague years. So what ended up happening was, like for you, for example, just to kind of quickly hop into COVID, like you'll see that there are independent people that are now doing tiffin. They start packing food and distributing free food. So in some sense, the public health trusts in the 19th century, which is the time period that I'm looking at, they also kind of start in the objectives of these trusts. they do talk about stepping in to deal with famine, with plague, with any kind of large medical, which will become a medical emergency. So those things cyclically they kind of repeat. So I was interested especially in public health trusts, and because of that I started studying the diseases that these public health trusts would have to address. So on a small level, like I was studying leprosy, cholera, plague, and influenza, etc., etc. So yeah, so plague becomes a disease that steps a little bit outside of some of the activities that are happening. And I was very much interested in the beginning few years of the plague, because that's when there's a certain way that the colonial authorities react differently from the other
So just so
pandemics.
people know, give a little bit of a background on what years we are actually talking about and what was India back then, because it was we were not really independent, so it was really in a different world altogether.
Yeah, so it's basically we are under colonial rule, British rule, and it is the plague hits in 1896, and it ironically travels through colonial ports, which is I think Yunnan and I can't remember the other one, but Chinese ports, and Hong Kong is also another port, which is also under British rule. So its plague comes from the sea, and the British authorities were very afraid that it would spread to Europe from Bombay. So it's like a dragnet. It's like a very uh, solid clamp down on the activities once the plague cases start coming up. And this is like 1896. So 1896 is when the first few cases start making themselves known, and then there's also another aspect of it is, which is there are different doctors, like there's Koch, there's Vladimir Hafkin. So Hafkin is in another part of India, and he hears about the plague in Bombay, and he comes. And he sets up a lab in Parel, and he actually synthesizes the first kind of vaccine.
So I want to get into that if now is the right time. So the first thing when I saw your work, and the first thing that struck me was in terms of the sequence of events, the sheer similarity between the plague that you were studying, you were looking at, and eventually representing, and something that we all collectively went through
Experience.
together. And there seemed to be like this direct translation of certain like salient features of the plague, right? So there's the question of misinformation, which of course all of us saw, but also something that you draw upon from the archival research back in the 19th century. There was a question of isolation, of hospitalization, and what you just mentioned, inoculation or development of vaccines. Can we pick on some of these like specific things and talk about it?
Yeah, I think what I was really interested in was actually looking primarily at myth, paranoia, fear, how it's like I've written it somewhere, like it's about the subaltern imagination. Like and my first access was to look at plague photographs, right? So there's this database of plague photographs at the Wellcome, in the Wellcome collection and the Wellcome library. And I had done some research there in 2016 for the same trust project. And what I was always struck by were the people that were always standing around what is happening. Like, so if there is, during plague, if the authorities are like spraying walls and spraying houses with carbolic acid, so there's disinfecting. Disinfecting is huge. It's one of the things that you do in order to clean the area, right? So cleanliness, dirt, etc., are things that are associated with what could be causing. So these are also linked to ideas of like miasmatic theory, which have been disproved, and the vector of the disease is known, etc. But at this point in time, uh, there is a default kind of going back to these already outdated notions of what is actually the cause. So in some sense, the vector of the disease, it is the flea, right? And the flea is on the body of the rat. the disinfecting actually causes the rats to flee, double E, flee from the surrounding and actually spread uh, to different parts of the
Yeah, you talk about
city.
this one instant where people are like, we should clean the cities, and they pour disinfectant all over the city, and that actually pushes the rats out of all the
Yeah,
places where they were
exactly.
hiding and actually turn into these vehicles of spreading the disease even more. And
Yeah.
you've drawn it quite fabulously in like really nice detail how that happens. And I think Surat, I don't know if Surat was part of the same plague, but Surat was infamous for what
So,
happened with the rats. And
yes. So Surat earlier also, I think, I'm not so sure, but the Surat outbreak of 92 is interesting in terms of a technological
mm, mm,
standpoint.
mm.
Uh, no, but to kind of quickly jump back to the disinfecting bit, there's always this at the point there are these strict measures. Now it's interesting. There is a time period within which there are people that are going to live within a time period that is between plagues, right? And we are now living in this epoch that we have experienced the plague, and we have experienced a pandemic and what it was. So at the point when even in 2016, 17, uh, it was something that you had 100-year, 150-year imagination of
Mm.
that there was something like this happened. It's a world-changing event that happens on a large scale, etc. It's just slower,
Mm.
and air travel and moving by plane is what kind of accelerated the spread in
Mm.
some sense, because otherwise it was by other means of transport. So that transport is an important kind of point that is new. There's always going to be different conditions for the plague, for any form of what we call a plague spreading. I don't know if I I completely.
Something which was really nice again in terms of the ideas that you bring out um is this very kind of almost natural collection or reconnection with the local deities which were associated with plagues and with measles or
Yeah.
smallpox or something. And you've drawn the Shitala Devi as a figure that kind of oversees
Yeah.
the plague and its reading of the plague. How was that something that you found as your own interpretation of the place, or do you think at that time there were explicit references to gods who are like gods
Mm.
of diseases?
Yeah, it is a reference to different gods of different diseases. Especially Sitla Devi is also she's a goddess of health, and
Oh,
she
I
has
didn't know that.
neem.
I thought she was always I thought she was always goddess of smallpox.
So smallpox by extension, she's been upgraded. She's now the goddess of chickenpox also. So people with chickenpox
Oh,
also pray. I
no,
mean,
but I
if you
never really
pray
thought of her as like the goddess of health. I thought she was always like
as
goddess of
extension. So this is what happens, right? Like I said, she's been upgraded to chickenpox. So even chickenpox, because neem, Sitla Devi, like there are the old grandmother tales of like, you know, you rub neem on the body to cool it down. So that was done for skin afflictions. So in the kind of if you see the drawings and the visualizations of Sitla Devi,
mm,
she has neem in her temple, in her crown, or she's holding it. So there is in those depictions of Sitla Devi, she's always carrying neem in her hand. So that was and it denotes like health as one aspect of it. Smallpox, yes. So the reason why I was specifically looking at Sitla Devi, and then there's the other goddess, which is Ola Bibi.
mm,
She's a Bengali goddess, and Ola Bibi became the goddess. She's the goddess of cholera. So these creations and these myths, this creation of these goddesses are also that you give offering in order to appease, so
mm.
that then there won't be like in terms of fighting the disease, right? So for prevention also. So when you pray to the goddess of a certain disease, you won't be afflicted with that disease. That's the idea also. And it's there for you go across the country, it'll be specific goddesses and specific people and specific gods and saints, etc., that are you keep them happy, right? And so I want, at the point when the plague hits, cholera and smallpox is endemic within India, within the region. It's in Maharashtra, it's in different parts. So I wanted to place, so in my drawing, it's a scroll drawing of about 10 feet by 2 feet. And on either side of the drawing, I place both these goddesses.
Correct.
And they both are looking into the drawing, so to speak. While the drawing itself is the events of the city, in the city of Bombay, specifically, the various kind of clamp down that is taking place due to the British officials. So the colonial authorities are now clamping down. So there's a David Arnold quote, which I think I should read, which is in his book Colonizing the Body. So he says, a likely explanation for the virtual absence of a plague deity compared to smallpox, sitla, or cholera zola BB is that the state's plague operations often preceded the arrival of the disease itself and were far more distressing. So it was the state's motives which provoked a crisis of comprehension, not the activities of an irate or capricious goddess. So this quote essentially helped me anchor, and he's a medical historian. So
yes, we have him on our list.
So he kind of, so David Arnold kind of frames the drawing for me.
Yeah.
In some sense. I was quite happy he went and saw the drawing too and welcome.
He did.
Yeah,
I think he's a retired professor emeritus now. Of course, like
a hush falls upon the room every time he walks up and down the library.
Really?
People recognize him. But yeah, so it was really nice that in some sense his this quote stuck, like kind of really struck me as being quite, like, there is no plague goddess, although there later on there are kind of there is one very interesting episode where in Calcutta, in one of the trams, a goddess, a woman walks into a tram, and she says, "I am the plague goddess," and everybody ran away, including the tram driver. So this is a kind of a small anecdote, which is, in some sense, there is beyond a point, then there would be someone that you would want to pray to in order to not give you the plague. So that reference of that deference, in some sense, was something that I was very interested in, and it became the framework for my entire drawing. And it's like the colonial theater. The two goddesses are watching, like, because those two diseases are in some sense contained, while the plague captures the imagination, and it also has this kind of it's immediate, and it's scary, and no one knows what to do. So and over that, the colonial authorities kind of clamping down, wanting to enter people's homes, becomes a way for them to know what's even happening within the state framework, within the city.
So I want to pick out on like two things you mentioned. We'll put it as two separate questions. The first one you mentioned, capturing the imagination of the plague, and I'm going to tie this very closely with your process of ending up with the drawing and the drawing itself. You did a lot of archival research. I assume you spent like weeks and months at the Asiatic Library, and one of the archival
years before that, but yeah.
And one of your like archival sources that was very fascinating was the comic series from the newspaper. Remind me the name.
Hindi Punch.
Yeah. And it's also something that I wanted to touch upon, and you mentioned earlier, was in terms of capturing the imagination, of course, the Hindi Punch comic series has a very satirical way of
Yes.
recording the events that are ongoing, right from the misinformation to the inoculation, and people trying to run away. And there's this one very fascinating cartoon of a Gujarati family trying to get a hot air balloon and be like, okay, if we like fly high up in the sky, we'll be away from the plague. So, in terms of capturing that imagination, would you say, do you want to talk a little bit about how this is also a way of recording subaltern history?
So the idea was to record this kind of subaltern history, but or in some sense, look for alternate archives. And because there is the colonial, a lot of the work that I do is also when I'm looking at the colonial archive, which is the omnipresent.
Correct, which would be like the government documents and your records and
documentation. If
numbers
you
and
go to
this
the
and
state
that, right?
archives, the old archives, anything that
Right.
you look at, it's the overarching kind of document that you're going to see is something that has been penned by the state. And a lot of my work is in some sense looking at it as a critique of that. So what I do is like the colonial document, if you look at it long enough, it shows itself up for what it's unable to do, what it's not ready to do. So there is a certain way that people are thought of, the what is happening, the people are treated there of a city are treated, gives you a clue as to what is happening, right? The colonial archive outs itself in
Correct.
some sense,
Yeah.
right? So that was one kind of work that is constant. And it comes out in the Snow Report, for example, which is the commissioner of Bombay at the time. And there's another commissioner, Gattaker. So these two people had they were the commissioners of Bombay at the time in the successive years. And they had been, so there's a 6-month report that is being written about what's happening, and it's a detailed report. And one of them, in the beginning of the report, is something known as the index of evidence. So this index of evidence is a very interesting document, because it says what is the actual cause, and it says what could be speculatively what could be the cause, but everything is treated as data. So it will equally say that the Gujarati traveler who is going to go to Surat every 2 weeks because he catches a train, he's the carrier, he's the vector of the disease. And right below that, it will be written, a rat could be the vector of the disease. So reading that data it's a form of looking at how people are being perceived as who could be the vector of the actual disease, whether it's the surroundings that people live in, or and that links to miasmatic theory, and so those causes are kind of take their own route, right? Now, in terms of that's one way of looking at it. The alternate was, I was looking for alternate archives, and it was the medical historian Mridula Ramana who told me to kind of look at the Hindi Punch, which is actually the Parsi Punch. They changed the name to the Hindi Punch to increase their viewership. So it's basically the Hindi Punch is the set of people, could be mostly Parsi, could be mixed, who are, in some sense, they are creating this alternate archive, and they're creating this kind of comic. It comes from the Punch. If you see, the British magazine Punch is also a comic cartoon book, a kind of a newsletter that is released every month. And so the Hindi Punch or the Parsi Punch is the Indian version of it.
Right.
And what's really interesting is that even if it's not actually documenting the event itself or what the government is doing, it becomes this kind of form of a potent critique. Because what it does is it will talk about, say, there's a comic that says that, oh, I wish people would like trust Vladimir Hafkin more, and people will get inoculated. So they're saying that people are not getting inoculated. That's the embedded data that you're reading. And people are scared, for example. So they make these kind of speculative storyboards where where someone is saying that quick, hide the body of your dead brother because they are going to come and take them.
Which ties well with what you were saying about colonial authority, literally like raiding people's houses and taking people who were sick.
Taking people. And then the other thing is people are scared that they think that if you put them in a hospital, they're going to die. And if they're dying of the plague, that is the added kind of fear. So that fear is, you know, so vaccine is the inoculation of fear, as one comic, you know, which was so the Hindi Punch becomes this very interesting archive, because even though it's a comic that is a speculative setting of it's actually tying into actual events that are happening, and it's also a form of lampooning of the government, because if the government allows it allows it because people need that like comic relief, you know. So it's obviously it's a heavy time, like how we also felt, you know, in terms of COVID in the beginning. As time passes, the fear abates. You know, you're washing your hands 4 times and then you're washing it twice, and then you're not washing your hands.
Then you're like, "Jo hona hoga hoga."
And there are funny memes about that also, about hand washing, etc. So those things become a way to calibrate what is the pulse of how people are feeling. So I thought that was this really interesting archive of speculation that I wanted to insert into the drawing. So when dirt and miasmatic theory is being pushed as one of the causes of the disease, you see a Hindi Punch drawing where men are on stilts, and they're saying now the plague cannot come through the stilts, and because it comes through feet, through dirt, and that's how you get plague, you know. Or the opposite is like you mentioned, the speculative setting where the sun's rays will destroy the plague microbes. So we'll go in a balloon, and that balloon will carry us outside, above the surface. So even the ground cannot touch us. So it's something that within a family setting, someone is saying to just feel better. You're dreaming that possibility. So I make the drawing of the balloon, and I use the setting of the 3 of them on this couch or whatever, and I place that in the balloon. So they are kind of flying away out of danger. So how do people deal? How are you dealing with this disease? What is your fear? What is your, you know, like the deepest fear? We all had some of that in the beginning. And all of this is not happening at the time when I'm doing this drawing. It's just starts, all of it kind of starts coming true in some sense.
And the second thing I wanted to pull from what you said earlier was about the colonial management of the plague, and there's been a lot of critique, and there's also been some very interesting documents that you've kind of cross-referenced into interactive version of the drawing, where when you kind of hover over this one part, they're talking about potential disinfectants, and they're also noting down what effect different disinfectants has, something like lime, and you're like, okay, it worked in this proportion and that proportion, and this did and this didn't, like all sorts of funny things, including drawings for mobile ambulances on carts and this and that. And I think what was really fascinating was to see the kind of effect this particular management and the way of handling the plague had on the urban landscape, the city and the town itself. And at one point, I think there was something about how after the plague there was a development of a sewage system. And this is also something, you know, a lot of urban designers, architects kind of speculated during COVID is, you know, are our cities built to blah 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 blah. Can you talk about some instances from the research that kind of highlight this nexus of the colonial rule and the city and planning and design, and how it all intertwines and has historically intertwined every time there has been a medical emergency of this sorts?
I mean, it's some form of looking at like medical infrastructure. I mean, at that point, the term of infrastructure itself is not a term.
Was lacking.
Infrastructure is a term that has come quite recently. But if you think of it in terms of, it's impressive, right? Like if you're saying that there's going to be specific hospitals, and hospitals that are where the beds are placed far apart, for example, you know, wartime hospitals have a certain way that they are designed, so that the passages are very wide, so that in time of emergency and more wounded or dead coming in, that you can line up the beds can be lined up even in the passages if there's no place. So you can't have narrow passages in wartime technically. So those war hospitals are designed differently, right? So similarly, the plague temporary shelters, hospitals that were built were built with this idea of managing a certain disease, exclusion, keeping people kind of segregated. So there are camps that are set up. There is all these kind of drafted diagrams of the hospital, of the carts, medical carts.
So very beautiful drawings, beautiful drawings.
Gorgeous drawings, yes. So it's seen as also activity. So there are and this is all happening simultaneously. Within a couple of years, there is what can be done to ferry either those who are ailing, and then there is designs of specific hospitals and kind of camps that
quarantine centers, something
quarantine
that
centers,
we're familiar
etc.
with, yeah.
So all of that is a specific architecture that is now making its way into, and all of this has a very visual impact on the city. There is like the spraying. There are photographs of like the using lime to kind of lime wash the walls of buildings.
Ranjit, something else also which you have also drawn in Hindi Punch also says is officers marking a house with like the number of patients inside, like dead, so many, sick, so many, and keeping like a very visual track record of who's alive, who's dead, like where to go, where not to go, like marking, the system of marking in towns and cities and identifying those zones. I thought that was also very like,
that kind of harks back to even olden times and even to mythological stories of like, marking Jewish homes with pigs. I mean, that's there. I saw that as a kid in the 10 Commandments of like Charlton Heston. And that's an interesting point because there is in that movie the plague that comes. There is actually, they show black clouds which is about the height of someone's ankle, and that those black clouds come and spread the plague and kill the subjects, except for the homes that were marked in Hebrew, right? So this physical manifestation becomes a visual representation of the plague. So I made a drawing about that for the trust work. So the idea that the miasmat, and also if you see in this drawing, I don't know if it's apparent, that there is miasma that is constantly moving through the drawing. There are parts of the drawing where there are swirls. I just draw swirls. So the swirls is supposed to be like clouds, like the miasmatic cloud, which is the plague cloud, which becomes in some sense, and it's it's thought of as being an entity.
Like it's very metaphorical also.
It's exactly, and it has intelligence because it is killing. Right. So what is it? And now we know what it is now, but at that time, the idea that people didn't know why they were dropping down, why something was happening to them, can create fear. And one way of dealing with that fear is to escape, to kind of leave, and to have this kind of mass exodus, which is so Bombay was 800,000 people, it became 400,000 people. Like people left. And then over the series of like it improving, people would come back to the city, there would be another outbreak, they would leave. And we saw that in COVID, where
it's like New York story, like 101 during COVID. It just left.
Exactly. And then in Delhi, and a lot of people walked. So those are the other things that happened that were all similar to. There's one whole section of the drawing that is essentially the part of the drawing is what I call exodus, which is people leaving the city. And within them is actually a goddess, Mansa, who's she carries a snake, and she's the goddess of rumors. I think there's
no,
I think so. I'm like, this is the thing.
The name's familiar, though, like Mansa Devi.
Yeah, Mansa Devi. So I've drawn her in the host of people that are leaving the uh
I mean, it's not
the-
surprising, right? Like if you have goddess for smallpox, goddess of rumor sounds.
yeah, I'm just trying to find the Mansa. I don't know if I wrote about her, but she's there in the drawing. Anyways, some other time. Uh, but yeah, so that becomes a way of um, I forget what.
The marking and the metaphorical.
So the marking, yes. So the markings are interesting because it's actually you're marking out which houses have which are afflicted with plague. So there's a cross and a circle, and I think the circle was that there is a plague, that the person has plague. So it's kind of basically the quarantine, which we see in different forms, even in COVID.
Right.
Which this is the state imposing these kind of rules, and so it's also to warn others. So
It's
it's
like
it
now
kind of,
having that app, the one saying
yeah,
you are in
exactly.
X radius of somebody who's at COVID, and then you would
Yes,
have like your
but
your
that's how do
remote
you?
sensing.
Yeah, but that would be also if everybody downloaded the app and
Correct,
if
correct. And mark, actually, like
yeah, and
honestly,
actually
mark it too.
mark, and so it's the state asking you to help yourself in some sense. In that case, while here it is visual, but it also has this kind of, it's degrading because it's talking about it being like dirt, the person
Mm,
being afflicted, that you are dirty and you're
mm,
not to be touched, right? So stay away. And then the second is I think the cross is if there was some other form of affliction which was not the plague. So it's usually circle, and in the circle with the cross meant that uh, there was some other affliction. Someone had some other disease or
mm,
something. That's what that was. But yeah, it becomes some of the ways that the public has to deal with the state imposing its order and control. So forcibly going into people's homes, extracting them if they're suspected, if they find that they have symptoms,
mm.
physically visual symptoms, then to separate them from family members, take them to segregation camps. And if they die there, you don't find out, or if they're there for a while and then they come back. So it's everything that is kind of starts. It can. It also depends on how the state behaves. Do they do
Mm.
enough to keep the public at bay, or they really anger? And does that lead to other things like riots, outbreaks, or I mean, people coming to the street?
Right.
So that leads to one very interesting thing, which was there's the Epidemics Act of 1897, which are kind of in some sense a form of like the Riot Act, which is
Mm.
you don't want more than 2 to 3 people collecting at the same time, you
Right.
know. And the old idea of like the Riot Act is like if people come together, then they will create trouble,
Yeah, they're
right? So you
conspiring against
keep
the state. Yeah,
conspiring against the state.
correct.
So that the Riot Act doesn't want, the state doesn't want you to act on that in some sense. And the disease is used as the point to say that in COVID it's used key not more than 2 to 3 people
Correct.
standing together, because it uses the idea of like that the breath, you have to stay far away. If it's influenza, and if it's not true for the plague, but it's still used. And the ironical part of it is that during COVID, the same Epidemics Act of 1897 was used to
Oh,
impose the
no
lockdown.
gathering. Yeah.
Yeah, so no gathering is the same. It's the Epidemics Act of 1897, which was written for the plague, which I'm studying.
Mm.
So it's not even like there's a new rule in place. It's the old, just the old Riot Act. Why change what's working?
Mm.
So that was this kind of one actual physical like connect. Uh, yeah.
So, Ranjit, usually my last question always is asking people what's next, but I'm going to reframe it for you this time. So all 30 or 39 episodes have always said what's next, but I feel like I'm reflecting on our conversation today and looking at your project and the beautiful drawing that you've done, that it's a larger commentary on the role of artists as people who are able to very openly, flexibly, malleably use the information available and make it more accessible. In your case, of course, you've looked at the archives and you've put it in a format that people want to look at it now. And I'm sure after COVID, you probably had like a surge in the number of people who've reached out to you because of the drawing. It's a two-parted question. The first part, I'm wondering about what do you think? What do you think about the role of art or artistic mediums in connection to history and kind of reacting to something that's happened years ago, while ago? And my second part to that is it's almost, I mean, even if we look at our conversation today, I would think of you less as an artist and more as a historian. And I feel like it's beautiful, the detail with in respect to how you've absorbed the information, how you've put out the information. Of course, you see historian writing books, but in this case, it's you as in the role of a historian put across something that it's not a book, it's a drawing. But I mean, if I had not probably mentioned in the intro earlier that you were an artist, I think you could well have been a scholar on the Bombay plague or a historian or a researcher. And to me, that intersection is something that I've never really thought about. And I have artist friends, I've spoken a lot of artists in the previous season as well. But especially maybe it's the project or maybe it's your process that I think really blurs the boundary of these two people, and I've seen them as almost mutually exclusive. But I think it's beautiful how you worked with the information, how you laid it out. So maybe not a question, but still.
Yeah. No, I kind of see it in some sense, not that they're mutually exclusive, but more as in terms of like a lot of my projects are kind of long duration. They are very they take years and years. So it's the in some sense it's the topic that interests me, and the art comes later or it doesn't, or
Right.
even the form of like making the work or even doing research for the work for me in the process is I'm quite ready to do research on something and then not have anything happen with it. If it no longer suits what I set out to do or some condition change. So you have to be able to walk away from that. And I don't know if I've never had to do that, but you have to be ready to do that because it's not serving the purpose in some sense. So a lot of my research is also to get to the bottom of something, but then it moves in, it doesn't behave, right? Yeah, what you want to do with it. You start any project thinking it's going to be this, and it's never that. It's always something else. You engaging data, archives, etc., change the project in its own ways. I think of the artwork as not separate from the historical aspect of it, but I want to kind of, in some sense, have the drawing itself looked at as a historical document. That's my kind of interest in like separated. It's usually separated out from the writing about something, and it can be either a visual aid or not, or whatever it turns into. So drawing for me in some sense is important because I draw, I paint, but the meaning of that is something that is always in flux in some sense. So doing research, being in an archive, studying, reading a book, collecting, gathering, having some response, which may not be the drawing, which may not be the correct way to try to bring out forgotten histories.
The medium is inconsequential.
Etc.
Yeah.
The main, yeah. So and even whether it is art or not, that is also inconsequential. It could be, uh, it could be looked at aesthetically or not. I like drawing, so as long as it's working for me for that topic, I would do it. If it doesn't work, I wouldn't. So I'd do something else.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I don't know. I can't remember the first part.
No, that's okay. That about covers it. Thank you so much for sharing your
Yeah.
work. We'll of course share links for whoever is interested in seeing it, and we'll take it from there.
Right. That was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Special thanks to Ayushi Thakur for the research and design support, and Kahan Shah for the background score. You can follow us on Instagram at arcofcenter and reach out to us through our website arcofcenter.com. That is ARCHOFFCENTRE. And thanks for listening.